Okay, welcome everybody to this roundtable on the struggle for the truth in the world's biggest autocracy. I'd like to express my appreciation on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute to the Canada Tibet Committee for sponsoring this event. I am Charles Burton. I'm a senior fellow here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and we have three distinguished presenters today. We have my friend Sherap, Therchin, the Executive Director of the Canada Tibet Committee, my very old friend Mehmet Tohti, the Executive Director of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, and my relatively new but not the least friend, Cherie Wong, who is Executive Director of Alliance Canada Hong Kong. Each of them will make an opening statement of maybe 15 minutes or less, maybe, and then we'll proceed with a discussion and give an opportunity for everyone here to pose questions of our panel. The world's biggest autocracy in the title of this event is, of course, the People's Republic of China, a regime that's under the strongman domination of Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping. Much of the western regions of today's People's Republic of China encompass the traditional lands of the Uyghur and Tibetan nations. And China's Inner Mongolia subsumes traditional Mongolian territory that has been separated by China from Mongolia, an independent nation, the People's Republic of Mongolia, which is located directly north of China's Inner Mongolia. Until the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party, under Chairman Mao Zedong, maintained that the People's Republic of China was a Marxist republic that comprises the peoples of four great nations: the Han, the Mongolians, the Tibetans, and the Uyghurs. And China claimed that its national policy was to respect the distinctive civilizational traditions of history, culture, and language of each of these non-Han nations. So the People's Republic of China, in addition to setting up provincial level governments, also created what is referred to as autonomous regions, where the language and culture and customs of the Mongolians, Tibetans, and Uyghurs were supposed to be protected under local governments led by their own people. And today, in addition to the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, the Tibet Autonomous Region, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, there's the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region, that's the most populous of them, the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region. But none of these autonomous regions comprise more than a fraction of the traditional lands of their original peoples. For example, the Tibetan Autonomous Region excludes the territory of Qinghai Province, which is entirely Tibetan traditional territory, and sections of the Chinese provinces of Sichuan, Gansu, and Yunnan, which are claimed by the Tibetan Authority in Exile in Dharamsala to be part of Tibetan national territory. Now, with regard to Hong Kong, in the early years of the regime, China refused to recognize the fact of Hong Kong and Macau as being colonies of the UK and Portuguese, respectively, and that they were outside of the rule of the government with capital in Beijing. The reason for this was because the UN's 1960 Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, and I quote, affirms the right of all people to self-determination and proclaims that all colonialism should be brought to a speedy and unconditional end. So China has acceded to this declaration, and despite the Chinese communist Marxist regime's unconditional support for liberation movements and decolonization in Africa and indeed everywhere, Hong Kong and Macau were excluded from, the idea that colonial people are entitled to liberation and self-government. So China has been very much opposed to the idea that the British Crown colony of Hong Kong, established in 1842, after successful decolonization, would be recognized by the UN as an independent, autonomous political entity, say a Republic of Hong Kong. Similarly, the autonomy of the ostensibly autonomous regions for Uyghurs and Tibetans was a sham. While a fiction was maintained that Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Mongolians and the rest were maîtres chez nous, masters in their own house, by installing a figurehead national minority figure, as they put it, as the head of the autonomous regional government, there was a notion that, this is a government of the Tibetans or the government of the Uyghurs under the People's Republic of China. But, as we know, the true power in all political People's Republic of China institutions rests with the leader of the commensurate Chinese Communist Party branch. And this figure in all of the autonomous regions has been nearly always a Han ethnicity Chinese Communist Party official who responds to directions from the party's political bureau in Beijing. So really the function of the Han leadership of the autonomous regions has been to suppress any nationalist movements demanding statehood for Uyghurs or Tibetans or the reunification of Inner Mongolia with the independent Mongolian People's Republic to the north. For example, in 1988, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping's predecessor as Chinese Communist Party General Secretary, was appointed the party regional committee secretary of the Tibet Autonomous Region, and at the same time, he was also appointed the political commissar of the Chinese Communist Party's local People's Liberation Army units. The People's Liberation Army is loyal to a political party, not to a state. The next year, after 1988, 1989, was the 30th anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan uprising. Hu Jintao ordered the deployment of 1,700 People's Armed Police into Lhasa to quell Tibetan protests against China's repressive rule. The Tibetan chairman of the Tibet Autonomous Region in 1989 was Yanden Norbu, who was a communist quisling of Tibetan origin. But it was Hu Jintao, the Han Chinese leader, who ordered the People's Armed Police to crack heads, not Yanden Norbu, who was a relatively powerless Tibetan nobody. Today, 73 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the situation for Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, and Tibetans under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party is worse than it has ever been. This, unfortunately, is associated with the failure of the political program of the Chinese Communist Party. The party under Chairman Mao Zedong came to power in 1949, October, all those years ago, imbued with the lofty ambition for China to lead the world revolutionary transformation to Marxist utopian communism. As the Chinese Communist Party's constitution still states today, the realization of communism is the highest ideal and ultimate goal of the party. When I was a young man living in Shanghai, one of my teachers told me that when he was a student at the same university, he expected China to achieve communism and a society of perfect harmony and prosperity without the need for government, as communism is, by 1956. But this dream was shattered by the abject failure of Marxist ideology and Maoist implementation, which led to famine and economic decline. We had the Great Leap Forward campaign, at which 40 million people died unnecessary deaths due to Communist Party failed rural agricultural policy of communization of the countryside. Then there was a last gasp at trying to achieve communism, the 1966 to 76 extreme political and economic program of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which was intended to turn great disorder under heaven into great order under heaven, and pave the way for the transition from socialism to communism as the end of history But the Cultural Revolution also failed badly, and it led to the regime abandoning the Marxist ideological basis for their political legitimacy. And what we have today is the vapid doctrine of Xi Jinping thought for socialism in the new era, which really has no ideology beyond the affirmation of Xi Jinping's position as dictator for an unlimited term, and his megalomaniac program for global domination, which he has characterized as the community of the common destiny of mankind, or humankind. With the realization of the lofty prospect of communism as the political raison d'etre for the Chinese Communist Party's rule of China now in abeyance, to sustain the political legitimacy, the Chinese Communist Party shifted its emphasis from being a Chinese Communist Party that is less communist and more Chinese. Chinese meaning Han Chinese. Of course, I think Cherie's upcoming thesis will discuss this notion of what is Chinese and so on. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party's program of revolutionary transformation to socialism was always at odds with the traditional structures of authority and religion of the ethnic minorities living in the People's Republic. Tibetan and Uyghur traditional structures of authority and religious beliefs were seen as feudal impediments to implementing the universalizing norms of Marxist-Leninist ideology. Civilizational norms of non-Han religion and culture were vilified as retrograde superstition to be replaced by political campaigns to purge counter-revolutionaries, replaced by the study of Chinese Communist Party statements and the study of the works of Mao Zedong and vapid propaganda. Traditional cultural products were replaced by socialist cultural products constrained by Marxist ideological norms to create a new socialist man without religion, without culture. Either revolutionary romanticism, which glamorized life under Chinese communist rule, or socialist realism, which depicted how horrendous life was before the proletariat, before the Chinese Communist Party assumed power. In the great proletarian cultural revolution, particularly in the Tibetan and Uyghur areas, there was mass destruction of the libraries and antiquities of non-Han people, designed to eliminate all residual vestiges of the spiritual bases of rich and meaningful ethnic identity. And you know, those people that destroyed that stuff were co-opted young people of Tibetan and Uyghur origin primarily. I mean, I knew them when I was in university. The civilizational culture of the 55 non-Han people defined by the Communist Party were reduced to a folkloric status as simple, happy people who love to sing and dance in traditional costume. Only the Han Chinese don't seem to love to sing and dance and are not simple and happy. The religions and ancient philosophies of their civilizational traditions were dismissed as backward and irrational sophistry. And then we have the issue of the resources in those regions. In addition to Tibet and Uyghur lands having rich resources of natural benefit to feed China's economic rise, China's west is also the route to Europe for the Belt and Road Initiative, China's global economic expansionist program. But China's developmental policies in Tibet and Xinjiang, to the degree that they have raised living standards, have in fact had the effect of feeding Uyghur and Tibetan nationalism, while the Chinese Communist Party believed that economic benefits and affirmative action programming directed at Tibetans and Uyghurs would lead to them feeling gratitude to the Han and spur the gradual rise in support for and identification with Chinese Communist Party's national identity and international agenda. The impact has been the exact opposite, and China has had to crack down harder and harder on Uyghurs and Tibetans who seek to simply be themselves in terms of their own identity. The intention is that Uyghurs and Tibetans would see the Chinese language and mainstream Han culture as the sole route to a modern technological future. But this has indeed heightened resentment and feared irredentism, the desire to expand territories beyond the borders defined by the Chinese Communist Party. And you know, the Uyghurs are demanding an independent Uyghur state called East Turkestan. In response, the Chinese Communist Party has successively implemented more and more stringent policies to suppress Uyghur nationalism, which has included limiting access to worship in mosques, Mandarin displacing Uyghur language and education at all levels, encouraging the mixed marriage of Uyghur women with Han men, and programs to relocate Uyghurs to work in factories in Chinese coastal areas far from their home villages. Eventually, extreme policies to take the Uyghur out of the Uyghur, amounting to a systematic program of genocide, has been adopted. Re-education camps have been built to imprison Uyghurs who are subject to torturous ideological training in Mandarin and forbidden to practice Islam in the re-education camps. Uyghur and Tibetan children have been sent to residential schools for education in Mandarin curricula in Han culture. They have been taught a history that falsely claims that Xinjiang and Tibet have always been ruled by the Chinese emperor and successor nationalist and communist regimes. Unconfirmed reports indicate that the Chinese Communist Party expects full assimilation of all national minorities in a period of 45 years from 2015. Xi Jinping now refers to the Chinese ethnicity, 中华民族, instead of Chinese nation of 56 constituent ethnic components. Xi's ideology is that China is a single nation with a single culture, a civilizational state. Similarly, in Hong Kong, in addition to suppression of the civil liberties extended under British rule after the handover of Hong Kong to the Chinese Communist Party in 1997, there is an ongoing movement by Beijing to suppress the instruction and use of the Cantonese language, the language being the instrument for the expression of Hong Kong's identity and culture, in favor of Mandarin Chinese as an assimilating force. So let me just finish and say that, you know, by observing that submission to the Han as a master race is the true meaning of Xi Jinping's much purported doctrinal promise of the common destiny of all mankind. It is about the annihilation of rich civilizational traditions and the genocide of peoples trapped in the People's Republic of China, nothing more and nothing less. So thank you for indulging that rant-like statement. Now I think we can move on, first of all, to a presentation by Sherap on the situation for Tibetans in Tibet.
Thank you, Charles. So I'm focusing on 5 different points. I'll be speaking on the narrative that China has built over the last 6 decades. I'll also be speaking on the evolution of the international support for Tibet, and of course the human rights situation, the current human rights situation in Tibet, the ongoing systemic discrimination, and finally a brief suggestion on solution or way forward to resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflict. So in context to discussing the collective struggles, the topic that we have chosen for this roundtable discussion, one of the most critical struggles that we must talk about is the false historical narrative that PRC has built for its occupied territories. It's critical because it affects all other struggles that we deal with, including the ongoing struggle of preserving national identity. A false historical narrative that Tibet has always been a part of China, and successful buy-in of the international community into this narrative has limited the unresolved Sino-Tibetan conflict as an issue of human rights, as issue of ethnic minority, and as issue of China's internal matter. But this wasn't always like this. In 1950s, right after the military-led invasion, 1960s, 70s, and even up until the 80s, the majority of people in the world, had some idea. They knew that Tibet was an independent country being invaded by a foreign power. There was strong awareness about the nature of conflict, being, one nation invading another. There was strong international condemnation, and there was even covert military support to Tibet, being fought inside Tibet and from the Himalayan regions of Nepal. And there was strong UN resolutions, supporting the Tibetans' right to self-determination, and there was strong support to the political support to the Tibetan cause, to the Tibetan leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. However, today, starting from the 90s and the 2000s, today, most people, without any conclusive evidence, believe that there is some kind of truth in China's claim that Tibet has historically been part of China. There are statements recognizing Tibet as part of China. And this unfortunate transition in the perception of international community we believe is the result of very effective Chinese propaganda spreading historical narrative. And this has been discussed most recently by the international conflict lawyer Michael Van Walt in his book Tibet Brief 2020. So he says that this is a rather complicated narrative that requires us to believe that China itself has existed for thousands of years, which most of us are conditioned. We have been conditioned to believe that. It requires us to believe that the Yuan dynasty Mongols, who conquered China, the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty Manchu, who conquered China, were Chinese, and therefore whatever relationship they had with Tibetans were between China and Tibet, which is not true. Tibet was part of the Mongol Empire, as were China, Korea, and Vietnam. Neither the Mongols nor the Manchus considered Tibet as part of China. It was part of their empires, just as China and other countries that I mentioned were on their empire. More importantly, Tibet was an independent country when PRC invaded in 1951. From 1910s up until 1940s, Tibet was an independent nation. It fulfilled all the criteria of being an independent country. And here I would like to quote Canada's Minister of External Affairs, Lester Pearson, who sent a confidential memo to his ambassador in Washington in 1951. Quote, "In fact, it appears that during the past 40 years, Tibet has controlled its own internal and external affairs. Viewing the situation thus, I am of the opinion that Tibet is, from the point of view of international law, qualified for recognition as an independent state." So what this really means is that China invasion of Tibet was one of the most fundamental violations of international law. The attempt to acquire territory through the use of force, and therefore the annexation of one's territory through a military force is illegal. And Tibet remains, the invasion of Tibet remains, a violation of international law. China did not obtain sovereignty over Tibet by its invasion or by its 70 years rule over Tibet. And this is something that many people do not get, is that simply being ruled by China for over 70 years doesn't mean that Tibet has become part of China. Of course, on the ground reality, it is Tibet today is being ruled by China. But legally speaking, Tibet is an occupied country, and China has no legitimate right to rule Tibet. Also, I want to add here that this unfortunate transition, the perception of the international community on the status of Tibet. Here, one particular example I wanted to make is that there's also a misperception about Tibetans not seeking independence or seeking a genuine autonomy based on middle way approach. The fact that the Tibetan government in exile, democratically elected leaders have pursued genuine autonomy based on middle way approach, it doesn't necessarily mean that they acknowledge Tibet as historically being part of China. And because this has unfortunately caused some level of misperception, and China knows this very well. And China has repeatedly exploited this by asking His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his representative to acknowledge Tibet as historically being part of China as a precondition to any Sino-Tibetan dialogue. And His Holiness has said that as a Buddhist monk he cannot lie and has not acknowledged what is historically and factually not true. So our sincere and compromised approach of trying to find a middle way is being exploited repeatedly by PRC. And here I want to do a really quick recap, a chronological recap of the steps of Chinese invasion in Tibet. 1940s, up until 1940s, Tibet was an independent nation. 50s, we saw invasion and the 17-point agreement that was signed, forced to sign. 1960s, the Tibetan autonomous regions that Charles talked about earlier was created. And 70s and 80s, we saw the creation of ethnic autonomy law. And now with the Xi Jinping, we see one nation, one culture, one language policy being implemented. The second point I wanted to talk about is the evolution, or rather the weakening of international support for Tibet. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1950s, we saw the denunciation of the PRC aggression, the invasion, and even the military covert support to Tibet. 60s, we saw UN General Assembly, adopting resolution on the Tibetans' right to self-determination, and reference to the resolution at other meetings at the UN General Assembly. 70s, we saw international community, especially in the Europe, started receiving His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the government meetings. 80s, we saw, of course, we are all familiar with the Nobel Peace Prize. There was a big gesture to the political nature of Tibet, not just the nature of the message of peace and compassion by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And then we, in 2000s, especially after the 2008 Beijing Olympic, where we saw a widespread protest across Tibet. We saw China using its trade relationship with countries and its influence to coerce international community into making a statement that Tibet has historically been part of China. And today, unfortunately, Tibet has issued has been kind of reduced and limited to defining as a human rights and ethnic minority issue, which is a very limited space when you don't talk about the political nature of the conflict. But I'm optimistic, especially in the last few years, we see a shift in the way the international community look at the China's and China's policy, domestically and internationally. I won't talk much about the human rights situation because I think most of us here in this room are familiar with the human rights situation inside Tibet, whether it is the forced colonial boarding schools in Tibet, whether it's the mass DNA collection, whether it's the religious freedom violation, including the forced kidnapping of the Panchen Lama, or whether it's the Chinese interference in the reincarnation of His Holiness Dalai Lama, or whether it is the forced migration of Tibetan nomads. I want to briefly speak about the systemic discriminations that Tibetans face in their daily life inside Tibet. For example, although travel documents are essential for one's participation in international trade, almost no new passports have been limitations imposed only on Tibet, not only on Tibetans, have a discriminatory impact on both corporate competition and on corporate privacy. With rights to labor, with respect to the labor rights, Tibetans, like all workers in China, are denied the right to form a free trade union, or to bargain collectively for better health, safety, and remuneration. Tibetan workers also face additional discrimination based on their ethnicity and lower levels of education. Skills development among Tibetans is outpaced by evolving demand and migrant workers from other parts of China, which fill the shortfall, thereby entrenching the inequalities. When Tibetans are hired, it's not uncommon for them to be paid lower wages than their Chinese counterparts for doing the same work. In theory, Tibetans should enjoy employment advantage in traditional industries such as wool processing, textile, but these sectors have not received sufficient support in China's development strategy for Tibet. Finally, attaining equal treatment poses a particular challenges for Tibetan women who are poorly represented in the local decision-making bodies of government and remain significantly underrepresented at the provincial and prefecture levels of government. In rural areas of Tibet, where most Tibetans live, a statistic from 2009, which is the most recent stats that we have, indicate that maternal mortality was 8 times higher in Tibet than in other parts of China. And just to suggest a few points on the solution or the way forward, as I mentioned earlier, as an activist, I'm quite optimistic about the changes that we have seen in the international community, including in Canada, especially in the last couple of years. So here are the couple of points that I feel we could focus going forward. So speak out on the political nature of Sino-Tibetan dialogue, encourage Chinese representatives to hold dialogue without any preconditions, and which is something that we Parliament of Canada unanimously passed a resolution supporting the resumption of Sino-Tibetan dialogue earlier on December 14, 2022. Government has shown support on this particular resolution. We would ask the international community, including governments, parliaments, media, public, to resist defining Tibetans as ethnic minority of China. Define Tibet as people with the rights to self-determination, and acknowledge and support the democratically elected leaders of Tibetan representative from the Central Tibetan Administration, which again I'm very grateful that we have continued to receive support from the Government of Canada to receiving the elected leaders from Tibetan government in exile. And find creative ways to support the historical independence of Tibet and counter Chinese narrative, such as this one. And so finally, I want to quote this a very recent terminology used by U.S. Senate in a bill on the U.S. State Department spending. So the wording says, funds made available by the Act shall not be used to produce or disseminate documents, reports, maps, or other materials that recognize, identify, or otherwise refer to Tibet, including the Tibet Autonomous Region and other Tibet Autonomous Counties and Prefecture as part of PRC, until the Secretary of State report to the appropriate congressional committees that government of the PRC has reached a final negotiated agreement on Tibet with the Dalai Lama or his representative with the democratically elected leaders of Tibetan people. So this came out just, I think, a week ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I take from what you said that we really shouldn't accept the PRC interpretation of the history of Tibetan regions. Secondly, we shouldn't accept that the PRC has legitimacy over the rule of Tibet, despite the articulation of a midway approach, that we should pay attention to discrimination within the PRC system against Tibetans, especially women, that Tibetans should not be defined as an ethnic minority, but that they should be seen as citizens with the right of self-determination. And finally, the resolution of the Tibetan issue is a dialogue without preconditions. I hope I got that right. Okay, next we have Cherie, who is the Executive Director of Alliance Canada Hong Kong, who will, I imagine, speak about Canada and Hong Kong.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Cherie Wong. I use she, her pronouns. Before I start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our presence here on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territories. I think an acknowledgement is not enough. We are settlers and colonizers on this land, and we actively benefit from the genocide and ongoing settler colonialism that Turtle Island has inflicted on Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. In my work to advocate for Hong Kong's self-determination, I am mindful to not perpetuate the systems of colonial violence and ground my work in solidarity and in allyship with Indigenous communities, not just here on Turtle Island, but in Palestine and also an ocean away in the PRC. It is a privilege to be here. My family have survived the famine and cultural revolution that Charles had mentioned. Though they never really spoke much about their experiences, I took it upon myself to do a lot of research and learning about their experiences and what they have witnessed. The pain and the trauma that my family has suffered has shaped and driven me into this work. To be able to sit here now, educated, residing in a liberal democracy outside of the Great Firewall, it's a privilege. To be young, to be a woman of a certain age, and not being seen and forced into a marriage, forced into having kids, it's a privilege. I would be what they consider a leftover woman in the PRC, but here I am, proud to be young, unmarried. It's a privilege to be here. I feel this strong responsibility to continue to challenge the CCP's ideology of totalitarian control, not only as a Hong Konger, but as a descendant of survivors of the CCP's violence and their oppressive governance. And I sit here as an ally to the Tibetans and Uyghurs who have done so much to challenge the ethno-nationalism and the assimilation into so-called the Han Nation, and the erasure of cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity is an act of colonial violence. Now, on to Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be called a window into the PRC. Human rights NGOs, labor's activists, and journalists were given some guarantees that they could operate safely under what was called one country, two systems. And since 1997, this guarantee of independent governance of Hong Kong's special administrative region for 50 years. But Beijing was not patient. The erosion has occurred since the handover, and interference from Beijing occurred in Hong Kong civil society for years. But Hong Kong has faced a different acceleration of interference since the implementation of the National Security Law in 2020. What we call National Security Law, NSL, was weaponized to target pro-democracy and opposition politicians at first. But then the NSL was used to target social workers, journalists, labor activists, and community leaders. And now we see the NSL being applied onto Hong Kongers with broader and broader implications. Just yesterday, the PRC's National Day of Celebration, where Hong Kongers were holding white flowers in silence, were taken away in police cars. This is a sign that Beijing is seeking to expand the implication of the national security law onto what we would see as less sensitive or really non-political actions. Hong Kong is no longer a window into the PRC, but rather a mirror of the totalitarian governance that is being inflicted onto the Chinese people. While the NSL and the police state would be what we call the stick, Beijing is also dangling a carrot in front of Hong Kongers, encouraging obedience with the promise of prosperity, elite capture of young professionals and business leaders to go into the PRC to do work, to do trade, to speak Mandarin rather than Cantonese, to be patriotic and loyal to the CCP. These carrots of becoming loyal to the party isn't just occurring to professionals, but it's occurring at schools, where young children are encouraged to be patriotic to Xi Jinping, to the party. They're encouraged to report political sensitive topics. They're encouraged to report their teachers, their families, a mirror of what was happening during the Cultural Revolution. Many in Hong Kong are speaking of this growing propaganda effort to influence young minds so that they would stop critical thinking, but rather obey the party. The erosion of civil rights in Hong Kong certainly accelerated during the pandemic under so-called health policies, but this continued beyond the pandemic measures and has significant impact on the business and expat communities in Hong Kong. Many have lost trust in Hong Kong Special Administrative Region's independence from Beijing, and as a result, many people who have funds and businesses are choosing to close up shop and to move their funds and to move their businesses elsewhere. One of the popular choices would be Singapore. And others are becoming hesitant whether or not they will stay in Hong Kong for the long run. Many are looking to relocate, some moving back to their home countries, others are looking at other Asian countries where they could feel more secure to keep their investments as well as business dealings. But this exodus from Hong Kong is not isolated to expats and foreigners. It is a reflection of Hong Kong residents' hesitance to stay in the city. Since the pro-democracy movement in 2019, many Western liberal democracies have offered various immigration pathways to Hong Kongers who want to flee the city, Canada being one of them. We have seen a study and work permit stream which allows Hong Kongers to move to Canada and eventually obtain permanent residency. This very generous PR scheme has attracted many young families to relocate. We have seen a huge influx of Hong Kongers, not only in some of the more populous cities such as Vancouver and Toronto, but even in Calgary and Ottawa, or in smaller cities like Halifax. But really, most do not have the economic and social means to relocate. You're asking people to uproot their entire lives, everything they've ever known, their careers, to move an ocean away where they know nobody, where they have no career choice but to start over again. It is a hard choice to make, but many young families, for the sake of their young children, have chosen to leave. And many continue to struggle economically and socially as a result of this forced relocation. And many other Hong Kongers don't want to leave, not only because they don't have the means to do so, but they don't want to leave their home. The home that has so much that they love, even though all of the things that made it home is disappearing and dissolving in front of their eyes. Those who chose to stay are forced into self-censorship. They are forced to conform to Beijing and Hong Kong's rules. They have no other choice but to do so. But Hong Kongers remain hopeful that there is a future where Hong Kong is finally going to be democratic and a place where it is ruled by our own people, where we are able to democratically elect our own legislators and be able to be free once again. I think it's important for us in Canada to examine our privileges here in a democratic and free nation and what that means. And I think as Hong Kongers move to Canada, a lot of them are looking to Canada to see that there is a democratic system that works, and hoping to take away what we learn here back to a free, liberated Hong Kong in the future. I didn't prepare much else as introduction note. I think for many of you, you probably have followed Hong Kong quite extensively in the last few years, but I look forward to your questions and discussion today.
And I'm sure there'll be lots of them. Really, I mean, this idea of pain and trauma and forced relocation, and I think, cultural dislocation of moving to countries out of the Cantonese cultural milieu where people can be who they are, in addition to the suppression of civil liberties and, as you say, forced self-censorship and watching your children being reprogrammed into a new identity based on loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. There is a lot of trauma and tragedy there. But I like your optimism about being free once again. I hope I live that long to see that. Maybe you will. So let's move on now to my dear friend, Mehmet Tohti, the Executive Director of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, who will give us some news about what's going on with Uyghurs under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and what we should be doing about it.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, our Tibetan friends and my dearest friends, to join us today. Probably just I would like to reflect my personal experience, my life, and evolution of the situation during my lifetime, how we came from point A to point B where we are right now. Maybe that is more convincing. And first of all, I would like to say that the October 1st was celebrated by China yesterday with fireworks and dances, this and that, and it is not celebrated by Uyghurs. And we, from my parents, I know that, and it was marked as a day of national mourning. And so the Uyghurs all over the globe, especially on October 1st, we take streets and we protest and we mark that darkest day of our history. And yesterday it happened in Vancouver and Toronto and Washington, D.C. That is a day of mourning for us. And secondly, just the introduction of China from Chinese Constitution. And because a couple of weeks ago, the German the Minister of Foreign Affairs called the Chinese president a dictator. And there were a lot of controversies why you are accusing the leader of the country as a dictator. And if you look at the Chinese Constitution, just let me read it for you. The People's Democratic Dictatorship led by the working class and based on an alliance of workers and peasants, which in essence is a dictatorship of proletariat, has been consolidated and developed. That is at the preamble and paragraph 6. The Chinese Constitution calls it as a dictatorship. And so there is nothing wrong to call the president of Xi Jinping dictator, because he is the leader of the dictatorship, according to the Chinese Constitution. And so, 1949 was the foundation of Chinese Communist government in today's People's Republic of China. And just 7 days prior to that announcement, and the 7 leaders of independent East Turkestan, Ahmed Chankasimi and the rest of his colleagues, and asked by Stalin to participate on that announcement of October 1st, called to Almaty from the Gulja, and the Soviets supposed to schedule a plane for them from Almaty to Beijing to participate. And so 7 leaders of the independent Republic of East Turkestan was mysteriously killed. And on the mysterious plane crash in somewhere in Mongolia. And the Chinese, the announcement they made on the eve of that plane crash. And the 7 leaders and the president of East Turkestan, independent East Turkestan, Ahmed Chan Qasimi, and Abdulkarim Abbas, and all 7 leaders just mysteriously died. And it is the conspiracy between Mao Zedong and Stalin, and because those leaders didn't want to be part of that announcement, didn't want to go to Beijing, and they were forced by Moscow because our country was squeezed between the Soviet Union and China at that time. And so just I would like to remind this the background. And so another the puppet leader at that time, the Saifuddin Aziz, he went to Beijing and stood just right beside Mao Zedong on that October 1st announcement. And so Saifuddin was the education minister of the independent East Turkestan Republic. And he became the governor till 1979. At the same time, he's the only Uyghur who was appointed as a government and cultivate their crops and started to feed their stomach. And from 1980s to 1989, and that was my adulthood, and that was my time. I went to university and I graduated, and I worked as a teacher teaching biology. And during that 10 years' time, for the Uyghurs, it was a revival, cultural revival. We opened up all the mosques confiscated by the government during the Cultural Revolution. And Uyghur scholars and intellectuals who sent to labor camps in during the Cultural Revolution, they came back, they started their academic work, and we had flourishing number of art, literature, and all kind of articles and magazines that just started to be published. And our education from high school, I know from the middle school to university, it was in Uyghur. And I used to teach my students in Uyghur language. I'm not talking about the last millennium, I'm talking about 1990s, till 2023. Uyghur language was enough to be used as academic language and a teaching language at the universities. So, 1989, it was the turning point, and until from 1989 to 1991, that 3 years was a transitional period. There were a lot of students' movement, and I was part of that movement. The students' protest, demanding more democracy, freedom, and then in the Soviet Union, a Perestroika movement, and in Eastern Europe, there were some movements to embrace democracy at the end, during that 2 years period from 1989 to 1991. The Cold War was over. Soviet collapsed. And Eastern blocs joined the Western bloc. And so at that time, China made some policy change without changing the constitution. They started to tighten up the political control. And I was a teacher, so I was dismissed. They started to arrest people. And in their mind, if we pursue sort of autonomous policy, probably we would end up like the collapse of Soviet Union, and we started to see some independent Tibet, independent East Turkestan, so we have to stop this madness. And they eliminated the Uyghur intellectuals. They started to put more Han Chinese, and started to transfer more Han Chinese with the privileges in the region. and the marginalized Uyghurs. So this movement started in 1991 and continued till 2021. And when 2021, the Twin Powers were attacked, and China immediately became the victim of terrorism, and then fight against terrorism started in China against Uyghurs and Tibetans, who were once more democracy, more freedom. Those people were put into the terrorist basket, and a lot of arrests and civil society or civil freedom, civic freedom, very limited available before all of them disappeared. And we started to see more police patrol, military patrol, and the show trial of people in big stadium, just life sentence, capital punishment, just to fear people, create more fear. So we came to 2009, after that pressure, the Uyghurs took the street again. And then more crackdown. And the Chinese government, of course, has run the propaganda show just to show on the one side of the story that Uyghurs attacked Han Chinese with the bloody face, this and that. But they never showed the Uyghur side of the story. There was curfew and the disconnection of internet and the human hunt down from the streets, from the neighborhood. Still, the Human Rights Watch announced at that time more than 1,000 disappeared. But still, we don't know where are these people. And the entire Uyghur neighborhood in Urumqi, the city, bulldozed, and people either disappeared or sentenced for long imprisonment. And in 2014, and another phase of that is genocide. And 2014 was a big shift for Chinese policies for Uyghurs, because Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, and they want to, that Xi Jinping thought that this is the time for China just to speak up openly. We are the global power, and we have to exercise our power, and we have to let others know that we are not just developing countries anymore, and we have to use our economic and political power and display that kind of power on the global stage. And so, in order to do that, they developed a plan just to get more countries in Asia or Africa on their side by promising them to help the infrastructure, investment, and connection to the markets, that kind of catchy phrases. So in order to achieve that plan, the land of Uyghurs, that part of land was important because the Xi Jinping announced 6 corridors for Belt and Road Initiative. 4 of 6 that corridor should go through the Uyghur region. And so Xi Jinping knows that Uyghurs do not want to be part of PRC. They are going to make trouble, if not today, in tomorrow. So we have to eliminate these people in order to achieve that bigger dream of Chinese dominance. And Xi Jinping basically said, we need this land, but we don't need people. We have enough. Started to put people in concentration camps and incarcerate intellectuals and any people of influence, and religious figures, or a businessman, whoever has kind of power that influence the mass. And we see that our family members start to disconnect us, start to disconnect from the WeChat, start to not to take any call from abroad. And my last conversation with my mother was October. We started to report Governor Erkin. He said annually we put 1.3 million Uyghurs, and we went through the education, and some of them still. And so it starts in 2014. Every year, 1.3 million people. Government took them, put them in concentration camps for forced indoctrination. Indoctrination means you have to deny or renounce your own ethnic affiliation and your religious belief. Just declare your loyalty to Chinese Communist Party. And this is the final solution in Xi Jinping's mind to eliminate the one ethnic. And recently, just now, it is a big news, headline news in major global media. Rahila Dawud, Professor Rahila Dawud, who was the wisdom scholar of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University and Harvard University. She did Uyghur folklore research in her lifetime. She's not a politician, she's a professor. She was taken and sentenced to life in 2018. No one knew about her life sentence till last week. Because she could. And she's not alone. More than 400 Uyghur scholars, doctors, PhDs, professors, the members of Uyghur academia, all of them taken in concentration camps, disappeared. And the Uyghur artists, just the performers, soccer players, taken to the concentration camps. If you look at the propaganda video just now on the Chinese official, from Chinese official narrative, you see the Uyghurs who are selling food on the street. And they're dancing without no reason, just people are dancing. And you don't see any members of academia. And you don't see the members of Uyghurs just running a successful business. It is okay to be peasant, it is okay to just sell street foods, but it is not okay for Uyghurs to be a member of academia or a successful member of the society and influential one. So this is how the Chinese, the social engineering project imposed to Uyghurs, it is still ongoing. And from time to time we exchange with the global affairs and we give names and we talk about this issue. And I always refer not only the Uyghur forced labor and the disappearance of the Uyghur intellectuals, it is part of the genocide. And that is part of the Chinese policy designed in 2014. Just to eliminate the influential part or religious leaders or the elite part of the society. And in Chinese mind, it is easy to rule other people when you eliminate them. And so this is the situation. And so as part of the concentration camp policy, some people, after a certain period of time, are taken away from concentration camps and sent to mainland China and scattered all across the manufacturing facilities, still under the control, semi-military control. Just to work for 14 hours a day without pay or little pay, and put people in a big dormitory, just one mat to sleep for each of them. And that was the plan, according to Nankai University paper, that changed the demographics at the same time to prevent the union of Uyghur youth to get married and to be reproductive. You are separating people from their social, cultural environment and put them in somewhere in mainland China. You are not allowing them to talk their own native language or not allowing them to practice their religion. And I put them in heavy military supervision and force them to work 14 hours. And the worst, you are preventing to people to mingle, boys and girls. And when you do so, and you put 1.5 million ethnic Han Chinese in the household of Uyghurs,
Yes.
where the male members in either concentration camps or labor camps. So these lines are already known, already documented. And for that reason, now the Uyghur genocide, Uyghur forced labor, transnational oppression, those big lines are oftentimes associated with the situation of Uyghurs right now. And when we are talking about genocide, and we are talking about the separation of children, and the prevention of birth, and inflicting condition to cause physical or mental destruction, and numerous deaths in the concentration camps, and the physical and the mental harm. And we are talking about those 5 elements altogether. And when we talk about the forced labor, at the same time we are talking about it because it's a part of the genocide. But basically, you are not only pushing people to work for free as a slave, you are preventing them to get married and to reproduce. It's the prevention of birth. For that reason, oftentimes I say the forced labor is part of the genocide, because that is designed in such a way. And at the end, we are oftentimes discussing with our policy and legal advisors what we can do and what kind of policy or administrative measures we can introduce or we can activate if it exists, just to address this issue. And so in Canada, we have a national conversation now about Chinese interference and transnational oppression. And we also know that there is no dedicated mechanism to address the transnational oppression. And many things changed globally, but we are a little bit falling behind to introduce a necessary mechanism to address those new developments, just like, for example, especially after the incarceration of, or I call abduction, the 2 Michaels, we realized that, we are not safe anymore. And the one Canadian citizen of Uyghur origin who's still in Chinese jail since 16, 17 years. It was the first, he was the first victim of transnational oppression. And still, we are trying to figure out what is the mechanism to address it. We have to figure out, we have to introduce. And if there's a need to establish a specific mechanism within RCMP or any government, we have to do it. If there's a need to amend our CSIS Act, we have to do it. RCMP Act, we have to do it. We have to do it. And for the forced labor importation or prohibition of the forced labor imports, and CBSA so far is failing to seize or intercept any products made by the use of forced labor. And it is open because we did not seize a single ship. It means there is a problem and how we can address it. Maybe there is a lack of political will from the government. And the government in 2023 budget included one passage just to pass a legislation and eradicate the forced labor importation from Canadian market in 2024. And we have to watch it, whether it will be delivered or not. And how Canada can be more active on an international stage by working with the allies. And if we look at our traditional allies and their steps taken to address these issues, we can see that we are falling behind. We are falling behind compared to, for example, UK or Australia. They already introduced the foreign agent registration bill. We are still discussing. Even it is urgent. We know it is urgent. We are still discussing. We did not make any tangible step just to give a hope for us. And if we look at the NATO, the change of NATO concept on the threat level, and Canada is not there yet, and despite we are the NATO member, we are not pronouncing the same threat level when it comes to China. And as G20, there are certain trends we can see, and we have to watch how Canada will react to fulfill its promises made during the G20 and NATO discussion. So this is not only a domestic issue, it is the future of Canada. And if we fail to handle the China issue and the China question, if we cannot find a proper answer for China question, and if we are not going to have an answer for our future interest and national security and safety and security of all Canadians, our national interest as well. As a Canadians, so we have to watch this story. And as Uyghur Canadian, it's my obligation just to remind the government officials and share our knowledge and assessment, and to try to get a better policy that serves, most importantly, for our country's interest, because we are Canadian and our generations will live in this country, and we only hope for the best for our next generation. This is our starting point. We are not only just advocating for the Uyghurs and Tibetans, it is advocacy work for the best interests of Canada. It should be taken in this way.
Thank you very much for that. And certainly you give a very comprehensive review of the history. I must say I was shocked when what you might refer to as moderate Uyghur figures, figures that were seeking reconciliation with the Han, were among the earliest to be taken into those camps that were just so disappointing. I just have to say one thing, which is not really relevant, but when you talk about those public executions, I witnessed a public execution in China in the Workers' Stadium in Beijing, well, from the outside. And I'll never get over the trauma of it. The people who are going to be executed are taken to the center of the stadium. Thousands of people, or I guess as many can hold in the Workers' Stadium, required to attend, and they would read the charge and declare sentence of death. And then the next sound you would hear would be the bang of the gun to the head of the person. And then, which really was chilling to me, the crowd would roar with, as if a goal had just been scored in a soccer game. Watching the person's death. So I don't think
it was orchestrated in this way.
It was designed to give an impression. I wasn't even in the stadium. I was only listening from the outside, and I'm still shocked. But anyway, perhaps we can move on. And I think that at the end of your presentation, you gave some discussion of where you think Canada should be responding to the unanimous resolution of the House of Commons that China is engaging in genocide in the Uyghur regions, and of course the forced labor. But I'm wondering, with regard first to Cherie and then to Sherap, Canada endorsed the 1984 signed British Declaration when it was sent to the UN. We were asked by China and Britain to sign off on that declaration, and we supported the Chinese government's commitment of Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, and 50 years, no change. Clearly, China has betrayed those international commitments to Canada, among other countries. Where do you think we should be, what should Canada be doing in this regard? And I think with regard to Tibet, after Cherie speaks, Sherap, we've had a number of resolutions of Parliament with regard to the situation in Tibet. Most recently, the Foreign Affairs Committee has adopted the Human Rights Subcommittee report on the Tibetan boarding schools. Our Parliament has made recommendations to the government many times about Tibet. It seems that, like Hong Kong, we don't seem to be beyond virtue signaling with regard to Canadian beliefs, but we don't seem to be doing as much as perhaps we could, or you may disagree with me. So I'm just wondering, next steps. What's the Canadian proper response to these very serious allegations of Chinese malign activity? And after we've heard from the two of you, we can go on to questions from everybody else here. I think Sanfei has many things to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think with regards to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, for one thing, for context, is the British government has already acknowledged that China is in ongoing non-compliance of an international agreement. And if we look at the PRC's history with international agreements where they continuously violate it without any consequences, they're going to continue to push that boundary as far as they can go. And they are in this process, not just the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but in any international agreement, they will continue to push that boundary. So I think in the case of Hong Kong, we need to really, as a co-signatory of this international agreement, we need to work with our allies and say, all right, China is not enforcing this international agreement. What are our options? What are some measures we can do to hold them accountable? Because if we continue to let someone not play by the rules, this is no longer only about Hong Kong. This is about international rules-based order. This is about what is the future of the international relations field. And as for Hong Kong's Sino-British Joint Declaration, I truly believe that Canada, along with other co-signatories, need to take serious actions into considering how we can ensure that this international agreement is respected, enforced. When it is not being enforced, we need to start thinking about the future. If they're not going to play by the rules, what are we going to do, not only with regard to Hong Kong, but in future actions, but for Hong Kong? What is the future of Hong Kong without the Sino-British Joint Declaration, without the principles of one country, two systems? Because certainly, the 50 years unchanged, it has changed a lot, and it's only been a couple decades. There are still 2 more decades of China continuously challenging this international agreement. So truly, we need to take concrete steps and strong steps to not only show China, but to show the international community that we are serious about enforcing international agreements.
Thank you very much. Sure.
Responding to the question on the parliamentary report with 18 different recommendations to the government of Canada, I wanted to focus on, because the study was based on the situation inside Tibet on the colonial boarding school. And although the report contained different recommendations which are not limited to the situation of colonial boarding schools, such as a situation of the Therchin Lamas, as the issue of the resumption of Sino-Tibetan dialogue. But I think not just Canada Tibet Committee, the other Tibetan groups who participated in the testifying at this parliamentary committee which conducted the study, I think we are all really hopeful that the government of Canada would at least take some of those recommendations seriously, including working with allies to this one particular action that was taken by the U.S. State Department Secretary Blinken in July this year, where he announced U.S. taking travel restrictions to Chinese officials responsible for the colonial boarding schools. And this is something, that I would expect and I would request the government of Canada to work with the U.S. government in taking similar actions. I know the government is planning to come up with the response on this recommendation sometime soon, and I hope something similar to the nature of the action taken by Canada, by U.S. would be considered. And also, there's been a debate going on. I wanted to acknowledge that recently Canada's ambassador and representative at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva spoke in support and expressed concern on the residential boarding schools in Tibet, in Geneva, and the side event on Tibet. That's something we really appreciate, and we hope there would be more statements at the multilateral platform expressing concern about the situation, in particularly focus on the residential school, while we have this attention on this particular issue. And we also expect some kind of a support to continue studying the situation of education policies in Tibet. We believe that what's happening to the young Tibetan children through the imposition of clothing boarding school, in some ways, constitutes a possible criteria of cultural genocide, and we want to continue that study, and we hope government would extend support in that area as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have question time, and I see Sherap. I'm sorry, Sampe's got his hand up, so perhaps we can start with you.
First of all, I'm sorry I was a little late. I was locked out myself and didn't notice the bell. So one of the reasons I think it's fantastic what's been said today is that in the work that we do, a lot of times we're looking at episodic issues. So we go to the government, we go to the media, and we say, this happened, that happened, that happened. And the media reports it as anomalies sometimes when they do report it, but I must say that by and large, the reporting on the Tibetans, it's episodic, and with a few exceptions, our media does not have the depth of knowledge and the possibility. There used to be a time when the Globe and Mail had people in Beijing, in China, and especially when they came back, they wrote some very illuminated books. And I'm thinking of a couple who have actually done that. So the context is not there. So when we say something, it's that. So today, I mean, what you said, I hope it'll go out. I hope it's successful in giving people some sense of what is actually going, the tectonic plate shifts, as Mehmet has so clearly pointed out. And this exactly, there's so many similarities to what's happening there, what's happening in Tibet, So the critical thing for us is, and I'll come to the Canadian thing, the acknowledgement that Tibet was an independent country, and by all from 1911 to 1951, this is very important. And there are many parameters on which to take this up. Number two, when we talk about Canada's actions, part of the problem now, as you know, is globally China feels that there's a shift in the alliances and things. So China's paying a lot of attention to the BRICS and to its own Belt and Road. So, how does Brazil, Mexico, if you look at where China puts its emphasis, because they see that shift to the global south as a way of leveraging their narrative and finding traction for their narrative. Though I will say, interestingly, there are something like 50 Mexican MPs that support, in some way or the other, the Tibet enterprise. We had, till recently, some support, not so much in the ANC, but in South Africa, which is also an important actor in this regard, Bishop Desmond Tutu and others. So we also need to create a counter narrative, I think, at a level, even in countries that seemingly are pro-Beijing, but their civil societies are not. Yeah, so that I think is, otherwise it becomes monolithic. We feel that Beijing's rise is such that we can counter it. And Canada can play a role in there. The thing that's always interested me is why Canada, as a middle-level G20 actor right now, is not able to connect with like-minded countries. And there's a ready-made, not a forum, because the Commonwealth is a series of disappointments. But Australia, Britain, New Zealand, and ourselves, we share so much in terms of a political culture and the way we manage things. I think Beijing gives a little more credence if this group of countries subscribes to this or pushes in the multilateral space than Canada alone. Because as you know, there's a lot of Uyghurs now in Beijing. Their sense is we don't deal with anyone else. We're peers to the United States and we'll overtake them in so many years. Well, you can see about that because all these projections, there are straight line projections, they have a thing of coming to grief, yeah? Especially around the economy. So that's all I want to say. That I think this is a very critical underpinning. I wish we could get this out more. And in just a very personal point, I want to share. My father was a scholar, a patriot, and one of our first broadcasters ever. He broadcast from India to Tibetan. So I'm looking around his papers after he died. There's a plethora of them. And I find this document that when he was at the Secretariat in Lhasa in 1946, so, we had, there was a copy, he copied a letter that the Cabinet of Tibet sent to Chiang Kai-shek, basically congratulating him for being on the winning side in the war. So they're doing in building these strategic villages 1 mile from the front. They're relentless. On every sector, they'll keep pushing. And their salami size everything, as you know, Mehmet was saying, how little bits and pieces. And the last thing I'll tell you, when His Holiness passes, they will find a place. Is to create that. So we have to series of disappointments. But Australia, Britain, New Zealand, and ourselves, we share so much in terms of political culture and the way we manage things. I think Beijing gives a little more credence if this group of countries subscribe to this or pushes in the multilateral space than Canada alone. Because as you know, there's a lot of Uyghurs now in Beijing. Their sense is we don't deal with anyone else. We're peers to the United States, and we'll overtake that in so many years. Well, you can see about that because all these projections that are straight line projections, they're coming to grief, yeah, especially on the economy. So that's all I want to say. I think this is very critical.
Which really I think of as family separation schools, because that's what they're doing, and indoctrination.
Yes.
And it applies both in Tibet and in the Uyghur region of China. And so the more that Canadians can speak out about that, I think, to really emphasize the death of the culture, because if these kids are growing up as Han kids, speaking only Mandarin and spouting Xi Jinping thought, then that's the death of both of those cultures in the long term. In the shorter term, I think it's really important that foreign countries in the West and non-Chinese regimes say that we should be working together on the economics of this, because part of what China has done in sending out forced labor across the country to work in factories making clothes for the Gap and H&M and Nike is implicating all of us. And we don't want to be implicated in this genocide. And we've seen just the last couple of years with the increased attention to Chinese interference in Canada, that people are starting to wake up to what tactics China has been using. And I think people now can get behind some joint action on the part of allies. Blinken's approach on the boarding schools is quite an interesting one, and that's something that we should be joining ourselves with in Canada as well.
Any more? Burton?
I have maybe somebody can give me an update, because I find that the power and creativity that young people bring to any political issue could, one of our speakers bring me up to date on the status of the Tibet support group, the youth movement within either Europe or other parts of the world. What are our Tibetan youth doing these days?
I think I just came here from Dharamsala this summer, attending Tibetan Youth Forum for 3 days, and the conference was about how do we reframe, the Tibet advocacy globally. And much of what was discussed was really what I shared today. how do we counter the narrative that China has been promoting, that Tibet was historically been part of China. And Tibetan youth, the average age, I believe, at that conference was around 22 to 25. So most of them are much younger than myself. And their interest to learning more about history, learning that, and many, they came from across the world, some from Canada, from the US, Europe, and they may not have been really familiar with the history of Tibet. They just know that, okay, Tibet was at some point an independent state, that we are not Chinese, we speak different language, we have different culture, we practice different religion. But to attend and to really hear from experts like Michael Wenwald that Tibet is legally an occupied nation is, I think, influenced them to really speak out more and reframe the whole narrative around the Tibet. So yeah, that's I don't know if that's
Well, this has been a wonderful occasion, and Sherap came up with this title, Struggle for the Truth in the World's Biggest Autocracy, and I think that there's a lot to be said for truth in a post-truth world. Maybe we could have some just final observations from Mehmet and Sherap and Cherie before we go home for lunch.
Thank you. And so, the issues that we discussed today is big issues, just like forced labor, translation of oppression, genocide, crime against humanity, and so it really needs a mobilized effort, not only from one country like Canada, but a mobilized effort by other countries as well. And another side of the issue is that as a country we have legally binding international obligation to address those issues. In the genocide, we are party to the Genocide Convention, and we are party to the Rome Statute. And we don't have to acknowledge the crime of genocide in order to take action on it. And as part of the Rome Statute Convention, as soon as we are aware that genocide is taking place, or as soon as there is a strong sign that genocide is about to take place, and that is the point that our duty to act is triggered. And so the government of Canada, there's no way that just come up and say, oh, I'm not aware that genocide is taking place, because Parliament has spoken unanimously. And in Tibetan case, again, the residential school, or from the Uyghurs as well. So these are the international crimes that state is committed against the defenseless people. And for that reason, we have an international obligation, legally binding obligation. How we can address it? And first of all, we are promised to prevent the genocide from happening. And what kind of measures we are undertaking right now? And I can say that none. And the second obligation we undertook from the Genocide Convention, prosecute those who are responsible for the crime of genocide. And did we take any action? As far as I know, there are the number of people sanctioned by Canada and the US and the EU. That's it. And also we have a responsibility to protect those victims of genocide. And in that regard, just the M60 is important. And still, we are 1 month away from the government of Canada to report back to Parliament. And what kind of report we are going to see from the government, that is a big question mark. And so there are something that we should do. And most likely I'm going to spend my this week of time in the chamber, just talk with the ministers and others. And because this is critical time we enter, and just whatever the report from Global Affairs and Immigration Canada present to the cabinet, and the policy and the frames or some other procedural steps how to implement that M60, it matters, and it matters. It affects the government's the future action plan. And for that reason, at least this is the least we can do as Canada. just to help those victim communities. And we are doing for Ukrainians without any limitation because they fled from war. And if we can take that responsibility as a country, and we should extend the same responsibility to those who escaped from genocide. Because war crime, genocide, crime against humanity, all of them regarded as atrocity crimes that is banned by international law. And for that reason, as a country, we have a lot to talk about, and most importantly, everyone at some point we start to receive a pension from Canada Pension Fund. And billions of dollars invested on Chinese companies actively engaged with genocide and the forced labor. And we are going to receive that money. It is just trouble for me. I need pension, but how can I spend that money? By knowing that part of my pension is going to come from the investment made on those companies actively engaging with genocide, crime against humanity, and forced labor. And we couldn't change the decision of the Canada Pension Board. And still our money, public funds invested, and the university endowment funds. McGill University alone has more than $119 million investment on the companies just participated in forced labor and genocide and surveillance. And similarly, University of British Columbia, University of Toronto, and many others. And so as a public, we have a responsibility just to, at least this is something to do with us individually, our pension, and our purchase, the things that we purchase. And so, as a personal level, we should know, just at least we should push with our elected MPs. Hey, I don't like to receive my pension from the generated fund, or at least some the interest from the forced labor, and then do something about it, right? And for our elected MPs, we have a legally binding international obligation. If there's a lack of mechanism, just create it. And this is a great country. We cannot just be silent against ongoing genocide and ongoing transnational repression and the active influence of the hostile states. And in some cases, just like intelligent operations in Canada, just killing our citizens. There's something wrong, and maybe something is lacking. We should figure out and address those issues. And this is, I think, the responsibility for each and every one of us.
Thank you very much for that. I must say the idea of my, in my declining years, going to Starbucks and buying a coffee with black money from a pension plan is sort of horrifying.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll just say that I think we're going through a very critical time that would probably, if we capitalize on it, would be remembered in the history. There's always a very short window of opportunity historically for any conflict, whether it is the Baltic states or Estonia. That the window of opportunity would be very short time frame, maybe a month, and if we can really grab that opportunity. I think China has opened up that window of opportunity from my observation. Last, with the Xi Jinping's growing aggression in the Indo-Tibetan border area, South China Sea, and we all know about the transnational repression, and most importantly, its aggressive policy, domestic, aggressive policy has really, I think, if the allies can work together, I think it could be a game-changing for democratic countries, and also more importantly, of course, for the persecuted groups, as Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and for Canada, I think as Uyghurs, Mehmet said, we don't speak just as persecuted group, we speak also as a Canadian citizen. What we deal with China is not just oppressor of Tibet, it is the world's largest autocracy, and that's what Charles has stressed, and I totally believe in that. Thank you.
Maybe to ground ourselves back into the title of this, the collective truth. Truth is radical in the face of someone who is actively whitewashing their crimes, not just the genocide in Tibet, in East Turkestan, but whitewashing their police violence in Hong Kong, whitewashing the crimes that have occurred since the foundation of the People's Republic of China. Truth is radical. It demands us to actively and proactively challenge false information, narratives that are being used to continue this oppression and suppression of vulnerable communities. And there's no end to this, right? Like, there is an entire party, an entire system actively going out to make these false narratives, to perpetuate their own totalitarian governance, to justify the violence they're inflicting upon communities and peoples and families. So truth is radical. It requires us to actively challenge things that are being spoken as if it's facts. So I think everyone here, we learned a lot today, and we learned about the disinformation and narrative discursion that the CCP is actively engaging in. So that requires us to bring this truth to our own work, whether it is to challenge the Canada use of pension, investing in forced labor, investing in genocide, whether it is to challenge the CCP's narrative on these forced assimilation residential schools, whether it is to challenge the fact that Hong Kong is now again a prosperous place because they have rid Hong Kong of pro-democracy activists. Truth is radical, and we have to keep being radical and challenge the disinformation that are being presented as facts. So I think we have a lot more work to do before we could truly be liberated and free, but we're not alone, and I think there's hope.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank again the Canada Tibet Committee for sponsoring this morning's activities. You know, I think about the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And, you know, I think today's activity really demonstrates the brother-sister emotion between diverse Canadians of Uyghur, Tibetan, and Hong Kong origin to a common cause, which is really about the triumph of good over evil. And thank you for attending.